The morning sun cast long shadows across the military compound as Staff Sergeant Sarah Martinez stepped out of the transport vehicle. The dust kicked up by the wheels settled slowly in the Afghan heat, creating a hazy curtain between her and the imposing figure waiting at the entrance of the forward operating base. Admiral Jack Thompson, a man whose reputation preceded him like thunder before lightning, stood with his arms crossed, his weathered face showing no emotion. Sarah had expected this moment, but nothing could have prepared her for the intensity of his stare. She was the first female sniper to be assigned to this particular unit, and the weight of that responsibility pressed down on her shoulders like the heavy tactical gear she carried. The other soldiers watched from a respectful distance, some with curiosity, others with barely concealed skepticism. The Admiral's voice cut through the morning air like a blade. "Why are you here, Sergeant?" It wasn't really a question seeking information. It was a challenge, a test wrapped in 4 simple words that demanded she justify her presence in a world where few women had ever set foot. Sarah had grown up in a small town in Texas where her father, a retired Marine, had taught her to shoot before she could properly ride a bicycle. The rifle range had been her playground, and precision had become her language. She had excelled in every training program the military had thrown at her, breaking records and shattering expectations. But none of that seemed to matter now, standing before this legend of a man who had seen more combat than most people could imagine. "I'm here to serve, sir," she replied, her voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her veins. "Same as everyone else." The Admiral's eyes narrowed slightly. He had commanded Navy SEALs through some of the most dangerous operations in modern warfare. He had seen soldiers come and go, had watched brave men fall and heroes rise. But this was different. The politics of having a woman in this unit were complicated, and he couldn't afford complications in a war zone. "Same as everyone else?" He took a step closer, his voice lowering to a growl. "Do you know what happened to the last 3 snipers who were stationed here? Do you understand the kind of pressure you'll be under?" Sarah met his gaze without flinching. She had heard the stories, knew the statistics. Snipers in this region faced some of the most challenging conditions in the world. The terrain was unforgiving, the enemy was skilled, and the margin for error was virtually non-existent. But she also knew something else. She was ready for this. The compound around them buzzed with activity. Soldiers moved with practiced efficiency, preparing for the day's operations. Helicopters thundered overhead, their rotors creating a constant background noise that had become the soundtrack of life in this remote outpost. In the distance, the mountains rose like ancient sentinels, their peaks shrouded in morning mist. Admiral Thompson had built his career on making tough decisions and reading people correctly. He studied Sarah's face, looking for any sign of doubt or weakness. What he saw instead was determination mixed with something else, a quiet confidence that couldn't be faked or taught. She stood at attention, but there was nothing rigid about her posture. She was alert, aware of her surroundings, and completely focused on the conversation at hand. "The enemy we're facing here isn't like anything you've encountered in training," the Admiral continued, beginning to walk around her in a slow circle. "These are fighters who have been shooting in these mountains since they were children. They know every rock, every cave, every advantage point. They don't take prisoners, and they don't show mercy to anyone they consider an invader." Sarah remained motionless as he spoke, but her mind was already working, already adapting to the new information. She had studied the terrain maps during her flight in, had memorized the tactical reports and intelligence briefings, but she knew that real combat was different from any simulation or training exercise. The stakes were real, and there would be no second chances. "I've read your file," the Admiral said, stopping in front of her again. "Top of your class at sniper school. Record-setting accuracy at long range. Commendations from every commanding officer you've served under. Very impressive on paper." He paused. letting the weight of his next words settle in the air between them. But paper doesn't bleed. Paper doesn't scream when it's hit. Paper doesn't have families back home waiting for it to return safely. The challenge in his voice was unmistakable. Sarah had faced skepticism before, had dealt with people who questioned her abilities based on her gender rather than her skills. But this felt different. This wasn't about prejudice or politics. This was about survival, about the lives of the men and women who would depend on her accuracy and judgment in the field. "Sir, I understand the gravity of the situation," Sarah replied, her voice gaining strength. "I didn't come here to prove a point or make a statement. I came here because I'm good at what I do, and what I do saves lives." For the first time since her arrival, the Admiral's expression shifted slightly. It wasn't quite approval, but it was something close to interest. He had seen plenty of soldiers who were confident in their abilities, but confidence without substance was dangerous in combat. What he was seeing in Sarah suggested that her confidence might actually be backed by genuine skill. The morning briefing was about to begin, and other soldiers were starting to gather near the command center. Sarah could feel their eyes on her, could sense the mixture of curiosity and judgment that followed her wherever she went. Some of them were probably wondering if she would crack under pressure. Others might be concerned about how her presence would affect unit cohesion. A few might even be hoping she would fail, just to prove their preconceptions right. But Sarah had learned long ago not to let other people's expectations define her capabilities. She had earned her place here through years of training, through countless hours on the rifle range, through proving herself again and again in increasingly challenging situations. She wasn't here to win a popularity contest or to break barriers for the sake of making history. She was here to do a job, and she intended to do it better than anyone expected. The Admiral glanced at his watch, then back at Sarah. "Your first assignment will be reconnaissance," he said. "You'll be working with a small team to gather intelligence on enemy positions in the eastern mountains. It's not glamorous work, but it's essential, and it will give me a chance to see how you handle yourself in the field." Sarah nodded, understanding that this was both an opportunity and a test. The Admiral was giving her a chance to prove herself, but he was also placing her in a situation where her performance would be closely scrutinized. Every decision she made, every shot she took or didn't take, would be evaluated and judged. "There's one more thing," the Admiral added, his voice taking on a more serious tone. "The team you'll be working with has been together for 18 months. They trust each other with their lives, and that trust has kept them alive through some very dangerous situations. You're going to have to earn that trust, and you're going to have to do it quickly." As if summoned by his words, 3 soldiers approached from the direction of the barracks. Sarah could tell immediately that these were experienced combat veterans. They moved with the easy confidence of men who had seen action and survived. Their gear was well maintained, but showed signs of use. Their faces were weathered by sun and stress, and their eyes held the alert wariness of people who had learned never to completely relax. The Admiral gestured toward them. "Sergeant Martinez, meet your team. Corporal Davis, Specialist Johnson, and Private Wilson. They'll be showing you the ropes and keeping you alive while you figure out how things work around here." The 3 men nodded politely, but Sarah could see the reservations in their expressions. They had probably been briefed about her arrival, had probably discussed among themselves what it would be like to work with a female sniper. She knew that earning their respect would be crucial to the success of any mission they undertook together. Corporal Davis, apparently the senior member of the group, stepped forward. "Ma'am, we're scheduled to move out in 2 hours for a 3-day reconnaissance mission. We'll be operating at altitude, so make sure you're prepared for temperature changes and thin air." Sarah appreciated his professional tone. He wasn't being overly friendly, but he wasn't being hostile either. He was treating her like a soldier, which was exactly what she wanted. "Thank you, Corporal. I'll be ready." The Admiral watched this exchange with interest. Unit cohesion was critical in special operations, and he needed to know that these 4 soldiers would be able to function effectively as a team. The mission they were about to undertake wasn't particularly dangerous by the standards of this deployment, but it would provide valuable insight into how well Sarah would integrate with the existing unit structure. As the morning briefing began, Sarah found herself standing among dozens of soldiers, listening to intelligence reports and operational updates. The scope of the military presence in this region was impressive, but she also understood that they were operating in hostile territory where the enemy had significant advantages. The mountains provided countless hiding places, and the local population's sympathies were often unclear. The briefing officer, a young lieutenant with the earnest demeanor of someone still new to combat, outlined the day's activities. Several teams would be conducting patrols in different sectors, while others would be manning observation posts and maintaining security around the base. The reconnaissance mission that Sarah's team would be undertaking was just one small part of a larger operational picture. When the briefing concluded, Sarah made her way to the armory to check out her equipment. The M107 Barrett rifle that would be her primary weapon was a formidable piece of machinery, capable of precise, long-range shots that could neutralize targets at distances exceeding a mile. She had trained extensively with this weapon system, but she knew that familiarity bred competence, and competence in combat meant survival. The armorer, a grizzled sergeant who had probably been handling weapons longer than Sarah had been alive, watched as she inspected the rifle. "First time with the Barrett in combat?" he asked. "First time with the Barrett in this environment," Sarah corrected. "I've used it extensively in training and on a previous deployment, but the conditions here are different." The sergeant nodded approvingly. "Smart answer. The altitude and temperature variations can affect ballistics in ways that might surprise you. Make sure you account for environmental factors when you're calculating your shots." Sarah spent the next hour methodically checking and preparing her equipment. Her gear included not just the rifle and ammunition, but also advanced optics, range-finding equipment, camouflage materials, and survival supplies for extended operations in hostile territory. Every item had a specific purpose, and every ounce of weight had to be justified. Corporal Davis appeared at her shoulder as she finished her preparations. "Ready to move out?" Sarah shouldered her pack and nodded. "Ready?" As they walked toward the vehicles that would transport them to their insertion point, Davis spoke quietly. "Look, I'm not going to lie to you. The guys are a little nervous about working with someone new. It's nothing personal, but in our line of work, you tend to be cautious about change." Sarah appreciated his honesty. "I understand completely. I'd feel the same way in your position." "The thing is," Davis continued, "we've heard about your scores at sniper school, and we've seen your service record. On paper, you're everything we could ask for in a team member, but out here, paper doesn't mean much. What matters is how you perform when people are shooting back at you." They climbed into the back of a heavily armored vehicle along with Johnson and Wilson. The engine roared to life, and they began moving toward the mountains where they would spend the next 3 days gathering intelligence on enemy movements and positions. As the base disappeared behind them, Sarah felt a familiar mixture of nervousness and excitement. This was what she had trained for, what she had worked toward through years of preparation and dedication. But she also knew that the Admiral's question would continue to echo in her mind until she found a way to answer it definitively. Why was she here? The simple answer was that she was a soldier following orders. But the deeper answer was more complex. She was here because she believed in the mission, because she wanted to serve her country, and because she knew she had skills that could make a difference. Whether that would be enough remained to be seen. The mountain air was thin and biting as Sarah's team reached their observation point after 6 hours of grueling hiking. The terrain had tested every muscle in their bodies, with loose rocks threatening to send them tumbling down steep slopes and narrow paths that required perfect balance. Sarah had kept pace with her teammates throughout the climb, earning silent nods of approval from Wilson and Johnson, though Corporal Davis remained professionally distant. Their hide site was a natural depression in the rocks that provided excellent concealment while offering clear lines of sight across 3 different valleys where intelligence suggested enemy activity was increasing. Sarah methodically set up her Barrett rifle, adjusting the bipod legs and checking the scope settings for the current atmospheric conditions. The altitude was nearly 3,200 meters above sea level, which would significantly affect bullet trajectory over long distances. Contact reports indicate insurgent movement in the Eastern Valley, Davis whispered, studying the terrain through high-powered binoculars. Command wants confirmation of numbers and equipment before planning any operations. Sarah settled into her firing position, her body naturally adapting to the familiar routine of long-range observation. Through her scope, she could see for miles across the rugged landscape. The valleys below were a patchwork of rocky outcrops, sparse vegetation, and ancient goat trails that had been used by travelers for centuries. Hours passed without significant activity. Johnson and Wilson took turns on radio watch, while Davis continued his methodical observation of the surrounding area. Sarah remained behind her rifle, sweeping slowly across predetermined sectors, looking for any sign of movement or unusual activity. The waiting was part of the job that many people didn't understand about sniper operations. For every shot fired in combat, there were countless hours spent in observation positions, gathering intelligence and maintaining vigilance. Patience wasn't just a virtue in this line of work, it was a survival skill. On the second morning, their patience was rewarded. Sarah spotted movement in the Eastern Valley approximately 2,400 meters from their position. Through her scope, she could see figures moving along one of the mountain trails, but the distance made positive identification impossible with normal optics. "Davis," she whispered, "I've got movement in Sector 7, multiple individuals moving north along the ridge line." Davis swung his binoculars toward the area Sarah had indicated. After several minutes of observation, he keyed his radio. "Base, this is Recon Team Alpha. We have visual confirmation of at least 12 individuals moving through Sector 7. Unable to determine hostile intent at this distance." The response from base was immediate. "Recon Team Alpha, maintain observation. Do not engage unless directly threatened. Intelligence indicates possible supply convoy in that area." Sarah continued her observation, tracking the group's movement through her scope. Something about their formation and movement patterns suggested military training. They were maintaining proper spacing, using cover effectively, and moving with the kind of discipline that indicated combat experience. "These aren't civilians," she murmured to Davis. "Look at their movement pattern. They're using tactical formations." Davis studied the group through his binoculars and nodded grimly. "You're right, and that equipment they're carrying isn't farming tools." Through her scope, Sarah could make out what appeared to be weapons and military-style equipment. Several of the figures were carrying what looked like heavy backpacks, possibly containing explosives or ammunition. This was exactly the kind of intelligence that Command needed to plan effective operations. "Base, Recon Team Alpha," Davis reported. 12 confirmed military-aged males, armed, moving in tactical formation. Appears to be a supply operation. Request permission to continue surveillance. Negative, Recon Team Alpha. Maintain current position but do not pursue. We're tracking additional activity in your area." Sarah felt a chill that had nothing to do with the mountain air. If there was additional enemy activity in their area, their observation post might not be as secure as they had assumed. The safety of any reconnaissance team depended on remaining undetected, and if enemy forces were operating nearby, their position could be compromised. Wilson, who had been monitoring radio frequencies, suddenly tensed. "I'm picking up local communications," he whispered urgently. "Multiple sources, close proximity." Davis immediately began scanning the surrounding terrain with renewed intensity. Sarah shifted her attention from the distant valley to the approaches around their position. If enemy forces had detected their presence, they would need to move quickly to avoid being trapped. "Sarah," Davis said quietly, "I need you to watch our 6 o'clock. Johnson, pack the radio. Wilson, start breaking down the equipment. We may need to move fast." Sarah rotated her position, bringing her rifle to bear on the terrain behind their observation post. The scope revealed nothing immediately threatening, but she knew that skilled fighters could remain invisible until they were ready to strike. Her finger moved to the trigger guard, and she controlled her breathing to maintain steady aim. Then she saw them. 3 figures were moving up the slope toward their position, approximately 800 meters away and closing. They were using the terrain expertly, moving from cover to cover in a way that suggested they knew exactly where the observation post was located. "Davis," Sarah whispered urgently, "we've got company. 3 hostiles, 800 meters, moving up the back slope toward our position." Davis cursed under his breath. Somehow, their position had been compromised. Whether through local intelligence networks, radio intercepts, or simple bad luck, enemy forces had located them and were moving to attack. "Base Recon Team Alpha," Davis called into his radio. "We are compromised. Enemy forces moving on our position, requesting immediate extraction." The response was not what they wanted to hear. "Recon Team Alpha, extraction not immediately available. Nearest support is 40 minutes out. Recommend you break contact and move to alternate extraction point." Sarah continued tracking the approaching hostiles through her scope. They were still 600 meters away, but they were moving quickly and purposefully. At their current rate of advance, they would reach the observation post within 10 minutes. "We need to move now," Davis decided. "Sarah, can you slow them down?" Sarah studied the approaching figures through her scope. At 600 meters, she could make accurate shots with the Barrett, but taking hostile action would immediately reveal their exact position to any other enemy forces in the area. On the other hand, if these 3 fighters reached their position, the entire team could be killed or captured. "I can take the shot," Sarah confirmed, "but it will definitely give away our position." "Do it," Davis ordered. "We need time to move." Sarah settled into her firing position, calculating wind speed, altitude effects, and target movement. The lead hostile was moving along a predictable path, following a goat trail that would bring him into the open for approximately 3 seconds. She would have to time her shot perfectly. Her breathing slowed, and her heart rate decreased as she entered the focused state that all snipers learn to achieve. The world narrowed to the view through her scope, the crosshairs, and the target. External noise faded away, and time seemed to slow down. The hostile appeared in the open section of the trail. Sarah's finger squeezed the trigger with smooth, steady pressure. The Barrett's massive .50 caliber round left the barrel with a thunderous report that echoed across the mountains. Through her scope, Sarah watched the target fall. The other 2 hostiles immediately dove for cover, but they were now pinned down by her position and unable to continue their advance. The shot had bought her team the time they needed to begin their withdrawal. "Good shot," Davis said tersely. "Now let's move." The team quickly gathered their essential equipment and began moving toward the predetermined extraction point. Sarah carried her rifle and essential ammunition while the others distributed the remaining gear among their packs. They moved as quickly as possible while maintaining stealth, knowing that their gunshot would have been heard for miles in the thin mountain air. As they moved through the rocky terrain, Sarah could hear the distant sound of additional movement. The enemy was responding to their gunshot, and more fighters were likely converging on their area. The race to reach the extraction point before being surrounded had begun. The withdrawal route took them down a steep ravine and across a narrow valley before climbing toward a ridge where helicopters could safely land for pickup. The terrain was treacherous, and the team had to balance speed with caution to avoid falls that could result in injury or equipment loss. After 2 hours of hard movement, they reached the extraction point. Wilson immediately set up the radio to establish contact with the incoming helicopters, while Davis and Johnson established a defensive perimeter. Sarah positioned herself to cover the most likely approach routes for any pursuing enemy forces. "Extraction birds are 20 minutes out," Wilson reported. "They're coming in low to avoid detection." Sarah scanned the surrounding terrain through her scope, looking for any sign of pursuit. The enemy fighters they had encountered were skilled and determined, and she knew they wouldn't give up easily. If they had managed to track the team's withdrawal route, they might attempt to attack the extraction point. 15 minutes later, Sarah spotted movement on a distant ridgeline. Through her scope, she could see several figures moving toward their position. Still too far away for accurate shooting, but definitely heading in their direction. "Davis," she called quietly, "we've got more company. Multiple hostiles approximately 1,800 meters moving toward our position." Davis checked his watch. The extraction helicopters would arrive in 5 minutes, but the approaching enemy fighters would reach effective firing range in about the same amount of time. It was going to be close. "Can you engage them at that distance?" Davis asked. Sarah studied the approaching figures through her scope. At 1,800 meters, she was at the extreme range for accurate shooting, especially in these environmental conditions. Wind, altitude, and temperature would all affect bullet trajectory significantly, but the Barrett rifle was designed for exactly this type of long-range engagement. "I can try," Sarah replied. "But at this distance, I'll need time to calculate the shot properly." "Take the shot when you're ready," Davis ordered. "We need to keep them at distance until extraction arrives." Sarah settled into her most stable firing position, using her pack to create a solid rest for the rifle. She studied the environmental conditions carefully, estimating wind speed and direction at multiple points along the bullet's trajectory. The shot would require compensation for bullet drop, wind drift, and the effects of firing at altitude. Through her scope, she selected the lead target and began tracking his movement. The hostiles were moving along another mountain trail, and she would need to time her shot to intercept the target at a point where wind effects would be minimal. The sound of approaching helicopters could be heard in the distance, growing louder by the second. Sarah knew that she would have only 1 or 2 opportunities to engage the enemy before the extraction began. She controlled her breathing, allowed her heart rate to slow, and focused completely on the shot. The crosshairs settled on a point ahead of her target's movement, compensating for the time the bullet would take to travel the distance. Her finger began the smooth, steady squeeze that would send the massive .50 caliber round downrange. The Barrett roared, and Sarah immediately began tracking the bullet's impact through her scope. 2.5 seconds later, she saw dust kick up near the target. The shot had missed by approximately 2 meters, but it had definitely gotten the attention of the enemy fighters. "Close," Davis observed, watching through his binoculars. "They're taking cover." Sarah quickly chambered another round and adjusted her aim point based on the impact of her first shot. The enemy fighters had indeed taken cover, but she could still see movement as they attempted to find better positions. The helicopters were now clearly audible, and Sarah knew that the extraction would begin within minutes. She selected another target and prepared for her second shot, making additional corrections for the environmental conditions based on what she had learned from the first shot. This time, when she squeezed the trigger, the result was different. Through her scope, she saw one of the enemy fighters fall and remain motionless. The other hostiles immediately ceased their advance and began seeking better cover. "Target down," Sarah reported. "The others are staying in cover." The extraction helicopters appeared over the ridge, flying low and fast to minimize their exposure to enemy fire. Davis popped a smoke grenade to mark their position, and within minutes, the first helicopter was settling into a landing hover near their position. Sarah maintained her overwatch position until the rest of her team had boarded the helicopter. Only when Davis signaled for her to move did she break down her rifle and sprint toward the aircraft. As the helicopter lifted off, she could see muzzle flashes in the distance where the remaining enemy fighters were attempting to engage the departing aircraft, but they were far out of effective range. As they flew back toward base, Sarah reflected on the events of the past 3 days. She had successfully completed her first mission with the team, had proven her ability to make accurate shots under combat conditions, and had helped ensure that all team members returned safely. But she knew that Admiral Thompson would want a complete debriefing, and that her performance would be evaluated carefully. The helicopter touched down at the base just as the sun was setting behind the mountains. Admiral Thompson was waiting at the landing zone, his expression unreadable as always. Sarah gathered her equipment and prepared to face whatever assessment he might have of her first combat mission with his unit. The debriefing room was sparse and functional, with maps covering the walls and a single table surrounded by metal chairs. Admiral Thompson sat across from Sarah, his weathered hands folded on the table as he listened to her detailed account of the reconnaissance mission. Corporal Davis had already provided his report, and Sarah knew that her version would be compared carefully against his observations. 2 confirmed kills at long range under combat conditions, the Admiral said when she finished. Corporal Davis speaks highly of your performance under pressure. Sarah remained at attention, unsure whether his statement was praise or simply acknowledgement of facts. The Admiral's expression gave nothing away, and she had learned that reading his moods was nearly impossible. However, he continued, I'm not convinced that 3 days in the mountains proves anything definitive about your capabilities. Combat in this theater presents unique challenges that can't be fully understood until you've been tested by them. Sarah felt a familiar frustration building in her chest. No matter what she accomplished, it seemed that there would always be another test, another level of proof required. But she also understood that the Admiral's skepticism wasn't personal. In his position, the lives of dozens of soldiers depended on his ability to accurately assess the capabilities of everyone under his command. Sir, what would you require to consider me fully qualified for this assignment? She asked. The Admiral studied her face for a long moment. That's an interesting question, Sergeant. What would you require? Before Sarah could respond, the door opened, and a young communications specialist entered the room with obvious urgency. Sir, we've received an emergency request for sniper support. High-priority target, extreme long-range engagement required. Admiral Thompson's demeanor immediately shifted from evaluative to operational. What's the situation? Sir, we have a coalition convoy trapped in Sector 4. Enemy forces have positioned a sniper in the mountains overlooking the only exit route. Our people are pinned down and we can't get close enough for a normal engagement. Intelligence estimates the hostile sniper is positioned approximately 2,800 meters from the nearest approach our forces can make. Sarah felt her pulse quicken. A 2,800-meter shot was at the very edge of what was considered possible with the Barrett rifle system, even under ideal conditions. In the mountains of Afghanistan, with variable winds and difficult terrain, such a shot would be extraordinarily challenging. Admiral Thompson stood and moved to the large map on the wall. Show me. The communications specialist pointed to a location in the mountains east of their base. The convoy is here, in this valley. The hostile sniper is positioned on this ridge here. Our forces have attempted to approach from multiple directions, but the terrain gives the enemy clear lines of sight to all possible approach routes. What about air support? The Admiral asked. Weather conditions are marginal for helicopter operations in that area, sir. High winds and limited visibility. Even if we could get aircraft in there, the target is well concealed and would be very difficult to locate from the air. Admiral Thompson studied the map intently, calculating distances and considering options. Sarah could see his mind working through the tactical problem, weighing risks and capabilities. After several minutes of silence, he turned to face her. This is your kind of problem, Sergeant. What's your assessment? Sarah moved to the map and studied the terrain carefully. The distance was extreme, but the elevation difference between the firing position and target actually worked in favor of the shooter. The mountain environment would create complex wind patterns that would be difficult to predict, but the Barrett rifle had the power to maintain accuracy at such distances. "It's a very challenging shot, sir," she said carefully. "The distance is at the extreme edge of the weapon system's capabilities, and the environmental factors will make calculation difficult. But it's possible." "Possible and probable are two different things," the Admiral observed. "What are the chances of success?" Sarah considered the question carefully. Confidence was important, but overconfidence could be deadly. "Under these conditions, with time to properly prepare and calculate, I estimate a 60 to 70% probability of success on the first shot. And if you miss, the enemy sniper will know our position and will likely relocate before we can attempt a second shot. The convoy will remain pinned down." Admiral Thompson nodded grimly. "Those people don't have time for us to think of alternative solutions. How long do you need to prepare?" 15 minutes to gather equipment and calculate preliminary ballistics. Another 15 minutes to reach an appropriate firing position and finalize the shot. "You have 10 minutes, the Admiral said decisively. "Transport is already being prepared." Sarah hurried to the armory to collect her equipment. The Barrett rifle felt familiar in her hands. But she knew that this shot would be unlike anything she had attempted in training or previous combat. The margin for error was virtually non-existent, and the lives of the trapped convoy personnel depended on her accuracy. The helicopter flight to the firing position took only 8 minutes, but during that time Sarah reviewed every aspect of the shot in her mind. She calculated estimated bullet drop, considered wind patterns in the mountain valleys, and visualized the target area based on the map coordinates. The helicopter set down on a rocky ledge approximately 2,850 meters from the target location. Sarah quickly established a firing position using the natural rock formations for concealment and support. Through her scope, she could see the valley where the convoy was trapped. But the enemy sniper's position was not immediately visible. "Base, this is Overwatch," Sarah called into her radio. "In position. Beginning target acquisition." "Copy, Overwatch. Convoy reports they can see muzzle flashes from the hostile position when he fires. We'll have them draw his fire so you can locate him." Sarah settled behind her rifle and began systematically scanning the ridge where intelligence indicated the enemy sniper was positioned. The terrain was rough and provided numerous potential hiding spots. Finding one concealed shooter in that environment would be like locating a needle in a haystack. "Convoy, this is base. Can you provide movement to draw hostile fire?" "Copy, base. One vehicle will attempt to move toward the exit." Through her scope, Sarah watched as one of the trapped vehicles began moving slowly along the valley floor. Almost immediately, she saw a muzzle flash from the enemy ridge, followed seconds later by the sound of the gunshot echoing across the valley. "Target acquired," Sarah reported. She had seen the flash and could now identify the approximate location of the enemy sniper. Through her scope, she could make out what appeared to be a camouflaged position among the rocks. Now came the most challenging part of the engagement. At 2,800 meters, the bullet would take nearly 4 seconds to reach the target. During that time, gravity would cause the projectile to drop significantly, and even a moderate crosswind could push it meters off target. Sarah would need to calculate all these factors precisely and account for variables that she couldn't directly measure. She studied the terrain between her position and the target, looking for visual clues about wind direction and speed. Dust patterns, vegetation movement, and heat shimmer all provided information about atmospheric conditions along the bullet's flight path. "Base, I need one more target reference. Have the convoy draw fire again." "Copy, Overwatch." The vehicle moved again, and again the enemy sniper fired. This time, Sarah was ready. She tracked the muzzle flash and identified the exact position of her target. Through her scope, she could now see the outline of the enemy shooter's position. Sarah adjusted her scope settings for the extreme range and began calculating her shot. The bullet would drop approximately 40 meters over the 2,800-meter distance. Crosswind from the west would push the bullet approximately 8 meters to the right. Temperature and altitude effects would slightly increase the bullet's velocity, reducing drop by about 2 meters. She set her rifle's crosshairs on a point approximately 38 meters above and 8 meters to the left of where she estimated the target to be. At this distance, the target appeared as little more than a dark shape against the rocks, barely visible even through her high-powered scope. "Base, this is Overwatch. Ready to engage." "Copy, Overwatch. You are cleared to engage." Sarah controlled her breathing and allowed her heart rate to slow. The world narrowed to the view through her scope, the crosshairs, and the distant target. She had made thousands of shots in training, hundreds in combat, but none had ever carried this level of difficulty or importance. Her finger began the slow, steady squeeze on the trigger. The Barrett rifle's massive firing pin struck the primer, igniting the powder charge that would send the .50 caliber projectile on its long journey across the mountain valley. The recoil was tremendous, as always, but Sarah was prepared for it. She immediately worked the bolt to chamber another round while keeping her eye on the target area through the scope. The bullet would take nearly 4 seconds to reach its destination, and she needed to observe the impact to determine if a follow-up shot would be necessary. Time seemed to stretch as she waited for the bullet to complete its trajectory. In the distance, she could see the convoy vehicles waiting motionlessly in the valley below. The lives of those soldiers depended on the accuracy of her calculations and the steadiness of her aim. 4 seconds after she squeezed the trigger, Sarah saw the impact through her scope. Dust and rock fragments kicked up near the enemy position, and the dark shape that had been barely visible suddenly disappeared from view. "Base, this is Overwatch. Target neutralized. No movement visible in the enemy position." There was a moment of silence on the radio before the convoy commander's voice crackled through. "Overwatch, this is convoy leader. Hostile fire has ceased. We are moving to extract. Outstanding shooting." Sarah continued to observe the enemy position for several more minutes, but there was no further movement or activity. The shot had found its mark at a distance that pushed the boundaries of what was technically possible with the weapon system. As the helicopter arrived to extract her from the firing position, Sarah reflected on what had just happened. She had made what was arguably one of the longest confirmed kills in the history of modern warfare, under combat conditions, with lives hanging in the balance. The flight back to base was quiet, with Sarah lost in thought about the implications of what she had accomplished. When the helicopter touched down, she saw Admiral Thompson waiting at the landing zone, just as he had been when she first arrived at the base days earlier. This time, however, his expression was different. As Sarah approached with her equipment, the Admiral stepped forward to meet her. 2,800 meters, he said simply. "Under combat conditions. First shot." "Yes, sir." The Admiral nodded slowly. "You asked me what would be required for me to consider you fully qualified for this assignment." "Yes, sir." "I think you just answered that question yourself." For the first time since her arrival, Sarah saw something that might have been approval in the Admiral's weathered features. More importantly, she saw respect. "Sir, with your permission, I'd like to continue serving with this unit." Admiral Thompson extended his hand. "Welcome to the team, Sergeant Martinez. I think we can find ways to keep your skills fully utilized." As Sarah shook his hand, she realized that his original question had been answered not with words, but with action. She was here because she belonged here, because her skills could save lives and accomplish missions that others couldn't. The 2,800-meter shot had been more than just a demonstration of marksmanship. It had been proof that she had earned her place among the elite soldiers of this unit. In the months that followed, Sarah would go on to serve with distinction, earning the respect of her fellow soldiers and the confidence of her commanders. But she would always remember this moment, when a single shot across a mountain valley had answered the Admiral's question more definitively than any words ever could. She was here because she was needed. She was here because she was capable. And most importantly, she was here because she had proven that gender was irrelevant when it came to serving her country with skill, courage, and dedication. The sun was setting behind the mountains as Sarah walked toward the barracks, her rifle secure in its case, and her place in the unit finally established beyond any doubt. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and new missions, but tonight she could rest knowing that she had earned her place through the most definitive measure possible in the world of military snipers. Accurate shots when they mattered most.